Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers. So this is Louisa Wilcox, and you're with Grizzly Times podcast, and here today with a good friend, George Wuerthner, who is a writer and a photographer, natural history buff. He's got an advanced degree in range, and he's written like 30 books, travelogues and natural history books, and books with titles like Clearcutting and Thrillcraft, and I'm delighted to have George here today to talk about his experience with bears and the wild.
I'm happy to be here, Louisa. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So, George, you've written so much about wildness and large carnivores like grizzlies and wolves. Maybe you can share a story about some experience you had in the wild, with the bear. Is there something that comes to mind?
Well, actually, I've had quite a number of experiences with bears, both black bears and grizzlies. The one that's it'd be hard to pick which one is most memorable, but one of the experiences I had was up in Alaska and at Katmai, which has a whole lot of bears, and I was kayaking around, and it was one of these things where I got up in the morning from where I was camped on a lake and went down to wash my face off in the water. And so I'm splashing water on my face, and I kind of looked down the beach, and coming right at me was a bear. And so I splashed more water on my face to make sure that I was seeing things right, and then moved back from the shoreline. The bear just kind of ambled on by and didn't do anything aggressive or anything like that, which seemed to be the experience there. And at the same time in Katmai, another funny thing, I was watching a fisherman fishing the Brooks River, and to his back, you didn't see a bear came out on shore and looked at him and looked at the salmon on the guy's fishing rod jumping out of the water. And then the bear dove into the water and grabbed the salmon. And so this fisherman is like got a grizzly on the end of his line, basically. and he's like panicking, not knowing, and he grabs a knife and cuts his line and races for the shore. That was pretty hilarious to watch. Anyway.
Yeah. Don't mess with a grizzly bear once you're fish.
Right,
that's great.
That's right. You can have it, yeah.
Yeah. So, George, you're well aware of this current debate about the protections of grizzlies in Yellowstone, and obviously there are many people concerned about delisting and the issues in court now. 6 different groups and tribes suing the federal government over removal of protections for the Yellowstone grizzly population. What do you think is the biggest problem with delisting?
Well, there's a whole bunch of them, but the biggest problem is that the bears are not at a population in the Yellowstone area where you can say with certainty that they are going to survive into the future. There's still too few of them, and the bears have unoccupied habitat, particularly the area south of Jackson in the Wyoming Range and along the Idaho border, the Caribou Mountains, and other Palisades, etc. These are areas that could support more bears and increase the population tremendously. And we need a larger population there to be certain that we won't have problems with genetic inbreeding or just climate change or something else that may make it more difficult for the population to survive. And we all know that small populations are more likely to go extinct due to stochastic events, and so that's the problem. The biggest problem I see, it's way too premature to be delisting bears.
So the issue of state wildlife management comes up in the context of delisting because it's about whether or not the states, when authorized with full responsibility for grizzly bears, can actually keep bears at the levels they are, let alone expand them to the levels that you're articulating that they need. What is the problem with state wildlife management?
Well, the state agencies have a conflict of interest when it comes to predators in particular. Most people don't realize that states rely on the sale of license and tags to fund their agencies. And so they're under pressure to produce things that can be shot, particularly elk and deer, and also, if delisted, grizzly bears. And the incentive is to maximize particularly the huntable species and opportunities for hunting, and often with the impacts on those animals secondary to providing hunter opportunity. And because of that conflict, they tend to often, in the case of predators, limit the number of predators and the distribution of predators. And in the case of things like elk and deer, often encourage more abundance than perhaps might be a good idea. And as a result of that, they have they tend to ignore science to a degree. And I want to hasten to say there's often a lot of good biologists that work for these agencies, and they recognize these problems, but they have to take the orders from above, and the people above are responding to hunters, and a lot of hunters are just not very well informed about predators, and so that they tend to respond to the lowest common denominator in many cases, and I just don't see where the state agencies are going to overcome that, because the constituency they see, even though they, by public trust, they're supposed to be managing wildlife for all citizens, they see as a constituency the people that are buying the hunting licenses, and many of them don't really care about long-term survival of species or enhance. They're more what can I hunt this year or next year attitude.
Right. So one of the issues that you've written about is a model called the North American Model for Wildlife Conservation, and it's a model that's used by the states. And you've noted in a number of different things you've written that this model itself, it codifies the philosophy of state game agencies. There's a real problem. What is the problem, and what do you think the solution is?
Well, the problem, the biggest problem is they don't actually follow the model as written, which says that, for one thing, for example, that no wildlife should be wasted. So using predators, particularly like wolves, or even most people that shoot bears are only interested in the hide as a trophy. You're wasting wildlife, and that goes against the model. The other problem with the model, again, it sort of ties back into the funding that I mentioned earlier, in that it tends to emphasize hunting over wildlife conservation principles in general, and so it sort of distorts the emphasis by these state agencies to provide huntable opportunities, huntable, bullet targets for bullets out there, rather than necessarily for the long-term ecological health of the landscape. So, for example, if you were to, we could use an example, would be with wolves to one degree. Wolves will tend to limit animals that have disease. So, for right now, chronic wasting disease is spreading through the Rockies, and the wolves can detect an animal that has it much sooner than we can, and it probably won't stop the spread, but it might, reduce it significantly, because they nip it in the bud, so to speak. They would pick up on an animal that has it earlier than anybody else, and so if you limit the number of wolves, you automatically give the advantage to the chronic wasting disease, and that is something that I don't hear fish and game departments, giving out as a good reason why they shouldn't be killing wolves. So that's the problem. Right.
So, George, you've written a lot on public lands and wilderness and the threats to public lands. And one of the things that you've written on is the explosion of ATVs, off-road vehicles, and snowmobiles now that can scale, cornices in the steepest country, and pack rafts. You can carry these rafts on your back, and paragliders in the wilderness. And you even wrote a book called Thrillcraft. Why are these craft such a problem?
Well, there's a number of things. There's the the fact that we basically have small islands of secure habitat for all these species, like grizzly bears and other wildlife that are sensitive to human intrusions. And the access provided by every new invention that comes along, whether it's more high-powered snowmobiles, whether it's mountain bikes that now can practically climb up a cliff. Every technological innovation shrinks this habitat in effect, because people can travel further, they can get into more remote country than ever before possible. And that puts a stress on the animals. Also makes them vulnerable to things like hunting as well. But it also puts a stress on the animals that are sensitive to a lot of human intrusions. And the problem for the wildlife around the West is that even our biggest areas of wildlands are not sufficient in and of themselves, and most outside of Alaska, that is, in and of themselves to sustain viable populations in many cases. And so we need actually to expand these wildlands, and what the effect of this access is it shrinks even the ones we have by making them more available to many more people to just to get in. And it's not that these people are being, have bad intentions. They're probably mostly unaware of the impacts they're having, but it still is an intrusion.
So, George, you've also you covered a lot of public lands issues, different aspects of it, including livestock grazing, which is an issue that many conservation groups just avoid. What is the problem with livestock grazing here in the West, and more broadly, what are the threats to carnivores from livestock grazing?
Okay, well, livestock grazing is the widest use of public land in the West. In that more acres are grazed by domestic livestock than any other activity that we permit on public lands. And in livestock, I would say even get into far more places than humans tend to even.
Right.
And so livestock grazing is a privilege on public lands. I want to emphasize that, but it is in effect treated as almost as if it's a right. And agencies like the Forest Service or the BLM that manage grazing on public lands are reluctant to do anything that negatively impacts the ranchers that hold these permits. And part of the reason for that is the livestock industry has a tremendous amount of political power in the West. And often because if you look around at the background of a lot of congressmen and senators, you'll find a significant number of them have contacts, or ranchers themselves, or have contacts with the agricultural industries. So in any event, the political situation is that livestock grazing is widespread, and it does a lot of damage in many different ways. Let me just articulate a few of them. One, you have water pollution. They're leaving their droppings and manure all across the landscape. And any place that there's a high concentration of livestock, studies have shown that the water quality doesn't meet state standards. And then there's the cropping of forage that would otherwise go into native species. There's only X amount of forage out there of high quality. And if a lot of it is going into a cow or a sheep, it's that much less for an elk or a deer or a bighorn. And then there's diseases, as just bighorn sheep is a good example. Domestic sheep can transmit a variety of diseases to wild bighorn that cause, in many cases, bighorn populations to collapse. There's the destruction of springs and seeps, and which are the sources of late season summer flows, which negatively impacts fisheries because there's less water out there than otherwise would happen. There's the damage to riparian areas, which are the green vegetation along streams and rivers that is the most productive part of the West. Even though they occupy about 1% of the landscape, 70 to 80% of all wildlife species depend on them at some point in their life. So if you damage those riparian areas, you have a significant impact on the wildlife. And to give you one example with bears often travel through and forage in riparian areas, particularly in the springtime, So damage to riparian areas, can negatively hurt bears in that way. Another impact is that the livestock being out there consuming that forage means less natural prey for animals like bears and wolves, because if that forage is going to a cow, it's not producing elk or deer or something like that. And then you have just the animosity that ranchers have towards predators in general. So you have things like wildlife services that's killing coyotes and wolves and bears, and that conflict and that destruction of our wildlife to favor private businesses operating our public lands is a real problem.
Mm-hmm. So we have a situation now around Yellowstone where livestock and livestock grazing and grazing practices and hunters, big game hunters, are the two biggest causes of grizzly bear mortality, which is a shift from what it had been a couple decades, decades ago, which was garbage. And this has been a real concern in recent years. The last 4 years, the population is not just not grown, which it hasn't for the last almost 20, but it's dropped because mortality is so serious and so high relative to livestock grazing and hunters. The states are saying no problem, the population's recovered, we can afford to, these losses. What would your response be, and what would you do about this situation?
Well, let me, since we were just talking about livestock, take that first. Think about this. The way that most livestock on public lands is managed is the animals are just set out there, and the rancher comes back, several months later and sort of gathers up what's left. And so if there's any mortality of cattle or sheep, that becomes an attraction to the in the case of grizzly bears, to the bears, and they're attracted to that area where the livestock is. So it becomes an unnatural attractant that puts them in conflict. In a sense, I would say, to make an analogy, it's like putting picnic baskets out there for the bears to find. And so you have four-legged picnic baskets all over the landscape, and then we kill the bears because they happen to find the picnic baskets. And the strangeness of it, of course, if anybody's been familiar with someplace like Yellowstone, if you leave a picnic basket out on a picnic table and campground for the night, you'll get a fine. But we allow the livestock industry to put all these four-legged picnic baskets all over the landscape, and there's no consequences to them or incentive for other than to diminish the losses for them to do something differently. So anyway, once a bear or a wolf gets a taste of domestic livestock, it often then finds that that it looks for other opportunities. So and instead of as I would do it, if I were king, I'd get rid of all the livestock on public land. But the next thing I would do is, if there is a conflict, I would say you remove the livestock, not remove the bear. In other words, if you're grazing on public lands, that's a privilege. The public has a right to have the grizzly bears there. It's the only place in many cases that they can be forage and live safely. And so if, for example, there is a depredation, then the cattle or the sheep should be moved, not the bears. And right now the opposite is true. And so I think that's one of the big problems. Now, with the hunters, we have a similar thing in the sense that, of course, gut piles are attractant to bears, and a lot of times what happens is a hunter comes back to where he's killed an elk or a deer. Often, particularly if it's late in the day, they won't finish gutting it out, and a bear will find it in the meantime, and then the hunter comes back and is surprises the bear, and then there's a lethal confrontation oftentimes because the hunters, of course, usually have a rifle with them, and so that is another problem, and it's growing in part because. At least some would suspect because other food opportunities for the grizzlies, particularly in the Yellowstone, have diminished. So we have less cutthroat trout for them, we have less white bark pine cones for them, and so the bears are focusing more on the meat part of their diet. and to the degree that they can find it, and these gut piles and are a real attractant to them, and it becomes lethal again for the bears. And so one of the things again with hunters that I would say is that all hunters should be required to carry bear spray. Bear spray is far less lethal and is shown to be effective against bears. And just like it's just like you have to keep a clean camp. If you camp in some place like Yellowstone, you got to hang your food. And then here you are right on the edges of Yellowstone. You're out there hunting, and you're leaving all this meat on the ground, and then sort of then blaming the bear if there's an attack on a hunter. And it just again putting the emphasis on the mortality and the blame on the bear rather than the humans. And we're the ones that are supposed to be smart, and we're the ones that should be able to mitigate these situations and reduce the occurrence by our behavior. And again, the agencies that are managing these lands are not, in my view, doing enough to. It's a funny thing. You'll get curbed, like I said, about making sure that your food is hung in, say, Yellowstone Park if you're camping there. Well, why shouldn't that be applied all the way through all the landscapes where there's bears? And it shouldn't be just in Yellowstone. And you're encouraged in Yellowstone to carry bear spray. And I'm really been surprised to see that difference in the last 20 years or so, where I almost never saw anybody with bear spray. Now I just don't see. I was skiing in Yellowstone last week, and I met a person on the trail who had bear spray in the middle of winter. So
you never know when they might wake up and be grumpy about it.
Right. I mean, but it's a good thing that they're that conscientious, is what I'm getting at. That people are at least in Yellowstone, the people that are hiking and so forth there have really adopted bear spray as one of the ways that they can minimize the having to kill a bear if there's any kind of surprise.
And one of the things that people miss a lot along the lines of what you're saying is the role of the parks in recovering grizzly bears to date. I mean, it used to be when there was rampant feeding of bears in Yellowstone up to the late 60s that the Yellowstone Park was where bears died. It was the epicenter of mortality of grizzly bears. And now Yellowstone is like squeaky clean, and the visitors are mostly prepared, including the person that you saw carrying the bear spray. So the problems are not in Yellowstone Park. They're sort of the example for everywhere else. It's bears are dying outside the park, whether it's in livestock-related accidents or, hunters or, just accidents of various sorts. So it's really shifted, and the Park Service, I think, deserves a lot of praise for what they've done.
Yes, I commend the Park Service for adopting policies, and even things like having closures to hikers at certain times. I think that again, that's making deferral to the needs of the bear rather than recreationists. And there's plenty of places to go hiking or canoeing or whatever. For example, some of the streams that feed in Yellowstone Park, you're not allowed to camp anywhere near them during June and early July when the cutthroat trout are spawning, so that the bears don't have disturbance. And, that's a perfectly good example of how to manage. It doesn't say the whole park is off limits, but we know there are places that are important for bears at certain seasons, and it's appropriate to maybe put some restrictions on the human access to those places. That gets back to the whole point of things like mountain biking and pack rafting and ORVs and all that other stuff too. But that there are even parts of Yellowstone like the Washburn Range, which I believe is just like off limits all year round, for example. And it's good to have some places like that in bear habitat.
Yeah, absolutely. So, George, you've been a critic of a lot of conservation over the years, conservation practices, some non-government groups, and you wrote recently about some of the adverse consequences that you're seeing of collaboration, which is one of the techniques that some of the non-governmental groups use. And to many, the idea of finding common ground is sort of a good thing, sort of a compromise in the middle through a collaboration. What do you see as the problem here, and what would a better approach be that you would recommend?
Well, I call it the collaboration trap. And what happens, there's a couple of things going on, but one thing that happens is in trying to reach an agreement with a wide array of interest groups, many of which have a financial interest, invested interest in the outcome, there's a tendency to go to the lowest common denominator. So if you're having a discussion about, for example, how much land should be protected as wilderness, and this is one of the areas that I'm most concerned about, the way it tends to go is the interest groups, and let's say the interest groups might be logging interests, grazing interests, say mountain bikes, and so forth. What happens is all those different interests say, here's what we want, and there's a tendency on the part of people working for environmental groups to agree to say, okay, we'll drop that area, we'll drop that area, we'll drop that area, and then what's left is what nobody else is interested really in. In other words, it's the land that you're never going to log, it's the land that's too steep to mountain bike in, it's the land that has no grazing allotments in it or very little grazing and so forth. So what happens is the wildlands get chopped up among these different interest groups, and what is best for the land and for wildlife is the secondary thing in trying to appease the human interest in the slices to the pie. And that, and particularly for environmental groups, I think what I'm paying people to do and advocate for is for the wildlife and for the wilderness. And we have so little wilderness and wildlands left that, to quote, I'm paraphrasing David Brower, but he said something to the effect that, I know I'll have to compromise. I just want to be the last person standing in the room that does so. And I think that's a good mantra that should be followed. Unfortunately, I don't see it followed there, because the other thing that happens is the organizations that hire people to participate in these collaborations tend to be people already who are inclined to want to get along. They want to be, liked by the other members. I repeatedly see letters to the paper or in newsletters saying, well, isn't it great that I can go out with Joe Blow, who's, the head of the timber company, and have a beer with him, as if that's the most important thing that you get out of a collaboration, instead of saying, I stood up for and tried to protect, 200,000 acres of wildlands. That doesn't even get mentioned most of the time, probably because they didn't protect 200,000 acres.
Right.
And so a good example of this is there's a collaboration that just came out on the Gallatin Range, which, Louisa, as you know, is just south of Bozeman and near Livingston. And the Forest Service has identified about 230,000 acres that's roadless. Of that 230, and I would say every one of those acres, people should be fighting practically for, to die on their swords to protect those 230,000 acres. And instead, this collaborative group that involved mountain bikers and ORVers and whoever else has chopped off large areas of the Gallatin Range, calling them, backcountry area or whatever. And they tend to be, in fact, the lower elevations, which are the most important wildlife habitat, including for bears. So you have an area called the Buffalo Horn Drainage, which is just north of Yellowstone Park. Is a very important elk migration route. It's very important for grizzly bears. It's also a potential area where we might have wild bison, and that's been designated as a backcountry area to appease mountain bikers. So those kinds of compromises, and this happens before you even take something to Congress. And Congress is the one that should be the compromiser, that has to work around these different agencies, interest groups. And I believe that the wilderness advocates should stand firm and be advocates for what's best for wildlife. And the end, you probably won't get the full amount that you're advocating for, but you might be surprised by the serendipitous way that Congress works, and things might come out better than you might expect. And if it doesn't come out as well as you expected or hoped for, you at least made your best try. And so what I see with the collaborations is that you have a small group of people who are making decisions in many cases for America as a whole that has an undue influence. And as I said, a lot of times there's real vested interests in there, that where people who, for example, in collaboratives where there's a lot of timber involved, you'll find that you'll have foresters, you'll have timber company representatives, county commissioners who like logging, etc., and they have just an undue influence in the discussion, and they set the parameters. I've been involved in a number of collaboratives tangentially. In other words, I can't participate in every meeting, and that's another problem. They have meetings that go on for years and years and years. But for example, if I'm one where there's timber and interests involved, it starts out with the assumption there will be logging, and I want to bring it back to, should there be logging here? That should be the first question, and then you decide, maybe it's not a place that should have any logging for a variety of reasons. But that isn't on the table. You have to agree right from the beginning that there's going to be logging. The same with, I was briefly on one that was largely in rangelands, and it was the same thing. There will be grazing. There's no question about whether that's an appropriate use in that area or not. So you have the agenda already preset by the participants that limits the discussion. And there also is a tendency with collaborations, because they have a set agenda in many cases, to ignore any contrary scientific evidence.
Yeah, and bringing this back to Yellowstone, where you started in your discussion also in the Gallatin Forest, where this collaborative has been looking at the disposition of, 240,000 acres, which is a big chunk of wild country. And we've seen that process, as you said, dominated by mountain bikers and the like, and yet we have a situation with grizzly bears and mountain bikers where there's some real conflicts happening. I mean, mountain bikers tend to, they're riding fast, they're riding quiet, they're riding often through dense trees. And we had a situation 2 summers ago up near Glacier Park where a mountain biker, very experienced guy, just literally ran into a bear, and it killed him instantly, raising questions about the extent to which mountain bikers are compatible, with heavily used grizzly bear areas. But on the Gallatin, too, we have a situation, as you mentioned earlier, where grizzly bears are dispersing from the core of the park because of the loss of key foods, whitebark pine seeds, and cutthroat trout in particular. So they're moving more and more to these peripheral areas, including the northern part of the Gallatin Range, some of these roadless areas you're talking about. And so we're seeing that bears need this additional habitat to just make do, and they're likely to find a conflict-ridden landscape with mountain bikers. And the interests of any conflicts are certainly going to be decided in the favor of the mountain bikers. So I don't know. It's a difficult situation.
Well, exactly, and this gets back to the point of access. Mountain bike can travel over a lot more terrain quickly, and so places that might otherwise be remote become not so remote. And there's plenty of studies that show that for bears in particular, if there's a lot of human activity in an area, they'll tend to avoid it often, and so. If that increases the human use in that area, particularly in the more remote areas, then that takes away from the refugia for the bears. And a lot of times it's not just a single linear pathway, and that's what people have to understand. It can be several miles on either side of a trail. It's a heavily used trail that might not be utilized anymore, and that might be the best habitat in the whole drainage. And so then the bears have to make this choice. Sort of, should I be in this area where I'm tense all the time and I'm nervous and potentially have a negative conflict with humans, or do I avoid it and not utilize the best habitat? And so I see that we're making these decisions, particularly, and this is another important point, Louisa, and I know you're aware of it, but that. We tend to think of what are the impacts on wildness and wildlife in things of like more resource extraction, like logging or mining or oil and gas, all of which are significant. But recreation can have its own impacts too, and even benign. And again, like I said, it's not done purposely, but it's benign recreational impacts. But it can still have an influence on things like bears and other animals that are trying to make a living out there. And I just think that we need to defer to them. And to the degree possible. And the thing about wilderness in particular is wilderness and parks are like our gold standard. Any other designation, that's why this idea we're going to make it a backcountry area. Nobody knows what a backcountry area is. We don't know what the legal protections are for backcountry area or whatever. And whereas we know what wilderness acts as, we have a good, firm grasp of how that will affect the landscape and the uses. And I think that's one of the reasons why people who are really concerned about wildlife and wilderness should be putting those interests first and advocating for as much wilderness protection as we can get. Keep in mind that in the lower 40 states we have about 2.7% of the landscape protected as wilderness. That's nothing. In other words, most of the landscape is open to, if you want to ride your mountain bike or you want to go drive your ORV or even use your bulldozer for recreation or whatever. There's plenty of places you can do that, and there's very limited places where we're protecting the sort of wilderness attributes and critical wildlife habitat.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of a story, a comment that a well-known biologist professor at Montana State University, a man named Peter Broussard, I asked him one time, how much land do you think grizzly bears really need? I was trying to get at how much we can compromise away, and he looked at me very seriously and said, every last square inch.
Right, exactly.
Because we have so little.
Yeah, and in fact, in recent years, there's been a recognition that there's this goal of let's protect half of the earth. And, E.O. Wilson, a very famous biologist, wrote a book recently about that, but the World Congress on Protected Areas has come out endorsing that. There's been a recognition by various governments around the world that we need to have more protected areas. And I think that it's achievable too. We may never get to 50%, but it's good to have a goal, just like civil rights for everybody doesn't exist, but we're trying to make that a goal for everybody. And it seems to me that when you have an area, the Gallatin Range, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, let's face it, it's not the nation's wood box. It's not the best place for actually raising livestock, and it's not a place that is appropriate for a lot of sort of mechanical and motorized and fast kind of recreation, whether we're talking about jet skis or mountain bikes or ORVs or whatever. But what it does best is it's wildness and it's habitat for wildlife, and that should be what is recognized as the number one priority for protecting, and to make all these other things, if they happen at all, be secondary to the primary purposes, which should be protecting the wildlife and the wildness. And because we don't have this opportunity every place else, you're not going to be able to do it in the middle of Kansas with its wheat fields. You're not going to have large roadless areas that are suitable for grizzly bears in some place like Kentucky or something. Grizzly bears are never there, but the point being that larger wildland protected areas don't exist in much of the nation. And what we have in the Greater Yellowstone is a world-class wildlands that for temperate zone, and there are very few examples around the whole world like that. And it should be that protecting that wildness and that world-class attribute should be the primary purpose of all the managing agencies and what would hope would be the primary purposes of the environmental groups that are associated with that region, which sadly, to my view, many have fallen behind on that goal and are not strongly articulating that.
Yeah, so George, you've got two children who are now grown-ups, but they grew up tagging along on your various wilderness trips across the country, hither and yon. And what kind of natural world do you think your kids are going to inherit?
Well, I do think about that a lot, and what to me is a sad state of affairs is across the whole globe, not just my kids, but everybody's kids we're diminishing wildlands at a record pace, and then factors like global warming are going to accelerate changes that are likely to have a negative effect on a lot of wildlife and wildlands as well. And so, for my kids, I think that when they look down the road, it'll be a diminished landscape for the most part, that will have less wildness and less wildlife, and unless we change an attitude in how humans relate to the world and start considering other non-human elements out there and trying to create space for them. And I sometimes see some trends towards that, but then it seems like right now, like under our current administration, backsliding, and that backsliding can take decades to recover from. And so the one thing that if you want to have an optimistic viewpoint, I can give you a couple of examples. I know you're familiar with this because you went to college in New England, but New England's a good example of passive restoration. A lot of people are unaware. For example, the state of Vermont was 85% logged over for farmlands and for logging back in the 1800s. And then a lot of that farmland was marginal, so it got abandoned, and we didn't have ways of saving the communities and the farms back then. So we didn't have, subsidized farm payments or anything. So those farms got abandoned. And then the forest came back, and with the forest, a lot of species came back. It may surprise people that in like the 1880s and 90s, there was no deer in all of Vermont. There was no black bear. There was no beaver. There was no moose, and so forth. And if you go to Vermont today, and this was all passive for the most part, now about 85% of the state is forested. There's thousands of moose, there's marten, there's fisher, there's, of course, beaver and bear and deer. And just last year, lynx were first lynx in 100 years in the northeast kingdom of Vermont.
Well, thank you very much, George. You're listening to George Wuerthner, and this is the Grizzly Times podcast. Thank you so much.